The external threats confronting Rome in the 3rd century would not have posed such a grave danger had they not coincided with deep and worsening internal problems. Foremost among these was a profound economic and demographic crisis that began in the late 2nd century CE and steadily undermined the foundations of the empire. By this time, the Roman economy had entered a prolonged period of decline. Although historians still debate the precise causes, the symptoms were unmistakable. A series of devastating plagues sharply reduced the population across the empire. By the middle of the 3rd century, birth rates were falling, agricultural output was shrinking, and many regions suffered severe labor shortages. Fields went untilled, towns emptied, and entire communities struggled to sustain themselves. These problems were not isolated, but interconnected signs of a much deeper and poorly understood collapse. As population and productivity declined, Rome's need for resources increased dramatically. Germanic invasions along the northern frontiers and renewed pressure from the Persian Empire in the east demanded larger armies, stronger defenses, and greater financial investment. Yet, the state now faced these demands with fewer people to recruit and fewer taxpayers to support the cost. The shrinking population meant that there were simply not enough men to maintain the armies, nor enough economic activity to fund them. Crucially, no one at the time understood the relationship between depopulation, taxation, military recruitment, and economic decline. The imperial response only worsened the situation. Army commanders demanded more soldiers, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that removing men from farms diminished food production and further reduced birth rates. Tax collectors increased their demands, not realizing that heavier taxation made farmers less productive and drove many into ruin. Desperate to escape recruiters and tax collectors alike, people began to flee their homes, abandoning their land and villages. This flight accelerated the downward spiral. As more people disappeared, fewer taxpayers and recruits remained, forcing Roman officials to increase pressure on those who were left. Recruiters and tax collectors were frequently driven out of villages, sometimes violently. In frontier regions, conditions became so intolerable that some Roman citizens invited Germanic tribes to settle among them, preferring the protection of foreigners to the oppression of their own government. What began as an economic crisis was becoming a broad social and political breakdown. Economic collapse was accompanied by political chaos at the highest level. Although republican institutions still existed in name, real authority rested entirely with the emperor. As long as the emperor was competent, this system functioned. But in 180 CE, Rome inherited one of its least capable rulers, Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius. Commodus was the first emperor raised from birth with the expectation of ruling, yet he proved disastrously unfit for the role. His reputation suffered among many groups. Christians condemned him for persecution, while senators despised his public behavior, which they saw as disgraceful, fighting as a gladiator, dressing as Hercules, and proclaiming himself the god's incarnation. Even after accounting for bias, his record as emperor was undeniably poor. He ignored the administration of the empire, spent vast sums on games, spectacles, and personal indulgence, and neglected the frontiers at a moment when strong leadership was desperately needed. Vain, irresponsible, and self-centered, Commodus embodied precisely the kind of ruler Rome could least afford. In 192 CE, he was assassinated, strangled by his own wrestling coach. His death ushered in a century of political instability known as the era of the barracks emperors. From 193 to 284 CE, emperors were routinely elevated by the army, overthrown by the army, or murdered by the army. On several occasions, the Praetorian Guard openly auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder. In the 49 years between 235 and 284 alone, Rome had more than 20 emperors, a stark contrast to Augustus, who had ruled for 43 years by himself. During this period, no one exercised sustained control over the empire. Provincial administration collapsed, tax collection broke down, and military recruitment became increasingly chaotic. Trade declined, food production suffered, and armies were too occupied fighting each other to defend the borders. At multiple points, the empire teetered on the brink of complete disintegration. And yet, despite everything, Rome endured. 2 centuries of cultural integration, shared identity, and imperial tradition continued to bind the empire together in spirit, even as its political and economic institutions faltered. The 3rd century was not Rome's end, but it was one of its most dangerous moments.